Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Melissa Siegel and I'm a professor of migration studies. I'm very excited to have here with me today a very special guest, Professor Hein de Haas, who's a professor here at Maastricht University and the United Nations University, as well as the University of Amsterdam. And today we're talking about different myths around migration. And one of the big ones is really understanding how migration policies actually impact migration and whether or not they're effective and in which ways. Hein, this is something you've actually worked quite a bit on over many years, both at Oxford and in Amsterdam and here in Maastricht. Can you tell us a little bit more about this relationship actually between migration policies and what we see happening in practice with migration decision making, for instance?
Yeah, I think the key issue is that migration policy making quite often are knee-jerk reactions to perceived migration problems that seem logical but don't really have the effect as they desire because they're not based on a real understanding of migration as a social process.
Yeah.
It always surprises me that, for instance, when you think about macroeconomic policies, a lot of advice is taken in of economists. So, but what happens if you raise the interest rate or if you decrease it a little bit, and a lot of modeling is being done. It's not perfect, but at least I would say the science is being taken seriously behind it. In migration policy, we often don't see that happening because migration policy often responds to a desire by politicians to be seen in control, like closing a border, imposing a visa, building a wall, or the reverse, to recruit migrants. But it's often a reaction to direct pressures to be seen by the public as being in control, or businesses lobbying for having more labor migrants in without real consideration of long-term consequences.
So that means that actually a lot of migration policy is being made without a very strong underlying evidence base.
Yeah, because
for that.
Yeah, I would say we have built over the last years as migration researchers internationally. The evidence is so much stronger. We have so much more knowledge about the effects of policies, but it's not always taken into account. So the migration science should assert itself more seriously, I think, in discussing and questioning some of the assumptions. Now, to come to the heart of the matter, we need to understand migration as a social process, not as a one-off movement between country A and country B, because that's where a lot of the problems begin. For instance, it seems very logical to think, well, I create a barrier. Let's say I introduce a visa or make it more difficult to get a residence permit or build a wall, indeed. You think, well, it should lead to less immigration because it is more difficult, more costly, more risky. But it doesn't take into account that people come and go. And we know from a lot of research that the most common pattern is one of circulation. Most migrants actually don't desire to stay. They go to a place to work, to study, or just to explore new horizons, and they tend to go back and forth or just have a one-off move and then go back. Now what typically happens, for instance, if you put in a border, is that yes, on the longer term we know it decreases inflows. On the short term it may not, because people have social networks and families that may help them to migrate. It may even increase migration temporarily, because migrants, if they realize that policies are becoming more difficult, there may be a now or never migration hike. But fair enough, on the longer term, definitely it decreases inflows. But, and this is the crux of the matter, it also reduces the number of people going back.
Yes.
Because if there's no migration barriers, if you're out of work or you don't like it anymore, you go back home because that's where you know your people. It's probably cheaper to live there, and people may wait until the next opportunity presents itself and then migrate again. Now what typically happens, and that's happened with Mexicans in the US and with North African and Turkish guest workers in Europe, the moment you put in a barrier, on the longer term, we really talk about 2 to 3 generations, when family reunification is complete, it may reduce inflows, but also people don't go back anymore.
But that's also already quite a long term. First, you're already talking about not seeing a real possible effect of serious deterrence, for a couple of generations, and that's really long term that we're talking about when a lot of these policies are put into place for a short-term solution in a way.
Douglas Massey, I think he's done amazing research in the Mexican migration project, one of the most prominent migration scholars in the world, and through fantastic data he's shown really very precisely how the US ended up with more migrants as a result of border closure instead of less.
Exactly. So this issue of really not almost allowing people to return or not giving them, incentives to just have their normal circulation is exactly what causes often a larger irregular migration population.
Well, that's the other issue. That's another. Apart from the fact that you may end up with more migrants in the end because it cuts off circulation. By the way, this is a huge policy dilemma. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have immigration policies. I think all modern states want to have some level of control about who is allowed to come and stay. But the dilemma is the following, is that the desire to control or limit inflows is very difficult to reconcile with the desire to increase returns.
Yeah.
So it's either or. And where the balance is depends really on the migrant group, how strong the networks are, and the factor that you just mentioned, labor demand.
Yeah.
Because behind a lot of migrations, and that's also one of the main arguments in The Age of Migration, the book we just published, is that the prime driver, if you look historically or in the current era of migration, is labor demand. I mean, we have refugees, we have other categories of migrants, but the biggest chunk of migration is primarily driven by labor demand. And that is another big discrepancy, that on the one hand we see in many wealthy countries in the world a combination of factors, which is demographic decline, declining birth rates, the native population that gets higher and higher skilled, but still continuous labor demand for all sorts of jobs, both higher and lower skilled jobs. Now, with higher skilled migrants, there is more and more, I would say, acceptance to even attract those migrants. The biggest discrepancy between rhetoric and practice is where we look at lower skilled migration. Because there the consensus, certainly in Western Europe, the political consensus is we don't need those migrants, which denies the reality of labor demand in a lot of sectors of the economy. We talk about agriculture, construction, cleaning, care, and a lot of other services that structurally depend on immigrant labor. Now, if you don't regulate that through regular channels, those migrants tend to show up as undocumented migrants.
Yeah.
The majority of whom entered legally, but then overstayed their residence permits and became undocumented. And that's why Douglas Massey argued that building a wall won't stop undocumented migration, because most of these people came in by plane.
Exactly.
And if they find a job and if they have family members, these people tend to stay.
Exactly. So that's another common misconception that, most irregular migrants are crossing a border irregularly, and in fact, most are not. Most have come in legally documented and then often overstay visas. So I think that's another important myth right there.
The case of Morocco is another. I mean, Morocco in many ways fulfills the same function to Europe as Mexico to the United States. Since 1991, European countries have tried to stop Moroccans from coming. Migration have only increased.
Yeah.
And it has actually, since 1991, visas were introduced for Moroccans to come to Spain and Italy. They used to circulate, just go to Spain for a few months and go back. The moment they introduced visas, permanent settlement took place. And now we see a massive expansion of Moroccan migrant populations in countries like Spain and Italy as a consequence, partly, of the border closure.
Yeah. Well, Hein, thanks so much for discussing several of these myths, actually, within this talk. We really appreciate you being here today. I'll make sure to put some more information in the description, links to work of Hein's, some blogs, his website, and also others that have been working on this topic. Thanks for being with us today. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and we'll see you next time.